Thank you, Sevda and Lena, for those probably excessively kind words of welcome, and my thanks also to the presiding spirits of this institution for giving me this actually rather privileged platform. I suspect that the most interesting engagements are going to be in the give and take after I've had my say. So essentially what I'm going to do is relatively briefly, you'll be relieved to hear, float a few balloons, attempt a few conceptual constructs about what I think has now become the largest issue, at least internal, but in many ways external issue of contemporary Europe, which is the Islam-Europe or the Islam-West engagement. The title I chose is obviously a little cheeky, interrogating liberalism. Normally the question is posed conversely, can Islam tolerate liberalism? But I think that there is a certain exclusivism that operates reciprocally, and perhaps it's not entirely futile to pose the question in those terms. Can liberalism tolerate anything other than itself is a question that has been posed at least since the late 18th century with some of the conservative reactions to the Enlightenment. So perhaps to make it a little bit less cheeky, I could rephrase it in these terms. Must one be liberal to belong to the West? Must one be liberal to belong to Europe? That raises probably another set of no less gigantic questions, but perhaps we can make a little bit more headway if we consider our not insignificant problem from that angle. It is a question that, despite all of the sincere or insincere multiculturalist denials, is being posed with increasing frequency and increasing urgency. And it's not just an outsider's question posed to hapless and often not terribly well organized or led Muslim communities, but it's a question that also tends to divide Muslims themselves. What is our relation to a society which has consciously chosen to leave behind many of those social forms, metaphysical views, pre-modern scientific cosmologies, which still are integral to the sense of identity and the sense of belonging of the majority of Muslims in the world. So it's an insider's as well as an outsider's question. And it is being put to us more and more urgently, and whether we're religious or not, or Muslim or not, we do need to have a fairly clear answer in our minds to this question. The European Union, as it struggles to articulate a common cultural as well as economic vision, regularly toys with the issuing of grand statements about Europe's identity. Europe is a vision of human community whose success underpins the universal model, which is now being urged with increasing enthusiasm upon the rest of humanity. European liberals, with their enlightenment, their civil society, democratic institutions and human rights codes, sometimes almost seem to self-define as a kind of secular messiah, willing and ready to save the rest of the world. And to resist is, by implication, to align oneself with a kind of sinful and unregenerate humanity, akin to the ancient Judaic rejection of the gift of the Messiah. But we Europeans are in fact in the middle of a difficult argument. We're constantly quarrelling with ourselves over questions of belonging. We can get together with increasing efficiency to build an Airbus, or it seems to bomb Libya. But will we really unite around a clearly defined cultural or moral ideal? What, after all, are the exact historical grounds for proposing a shared European identity, a European community? And this now looks like, as I've said, the continent's biggest expression of this larger question: how can Muslims fit in? It might be amusing or instructive if we consider the very distant roots of this question. The issue of Islam and modernity, Europe and Islam, is something that has its current epicycles that are sometimes played out in opinion polls and in national politics. But it is in fact the current version of a much older narrative of Europe and Asia. Remember how Homer, really at the beginning of European literature, tells us how Europa, who is the daughter of the king of Phoenicia, is abducted by Zeus, duly ravished, and carried off to the island of Crete, where she gives birth to the Europeans. And there seems to be something emblematic and transgressive about that myth of origin. A Lebanese maiden, torn from the breast of Asia and deposited in a corner of the continent that ends up bearing her name. So the beginning of our story seems to be constructed as a violent European raid upon Asia, an unhappy immigration and a confiscation of identity. Perhaps we can trace back that far, and I guess our literature does begin with Homer, Europe's ambiguity about itself and its values. But of course, Europa only really finds herself and discovers the limits of her soul and her body long after this classical prologue. For the Romans, it was not really Europe, it was the Mediterranean which defined the core of their terrain and their commercial and their religious life. Rome equally embraced the European, African and Asian shores of the Middle Sea. But while it saw itself as superior, it never sought to impose its philosophy or social values on others outside its frontiers. So I think we should hesitate to accept the currently quite common cliché that in our time ancient history has been reborn. America is Rome, Europe is Athens, while Islam is an endlessly troublesome monotheistic zealot Judea. Ancient Rome and Athens in fact never tried to globalize or universalize their values, even within the bounds of their political sway. Still less did they encourage other nations to accept their beliefs and forms of social organization. When Islam appears on the scene in the 7th century, the African and the Asian shores are lost. Thrown back on its own resources, Europe sought to define itself, then as now, as the prolongation of the rather small remnant of the antiquity that the Saracens had failed to conquer. And from that time on, there begins a constant conversation about its own unique and universal social rightness.